The wonderful and strange experiments that defy all human thinking are taking place constantly in the human body. There is nothing more mysterious in the alchemical texts than the mystery of digestion and assimilation in man. There is nothing more wonderful than how food is changed gradually within the stomach into all of the subjective energies necessary for the maintenance of the body. The stomach is the greatest alchemist we have ever conceived of. Yet these processes in nature, being natural, reasonable, and orderly, they seem to tell us that with nature everything is possible. And just as there are laws by which digestion is possible, so these laws operating in space can be understood and can be applied to other related or practical purposes. The very principle which makes it possible for man to live at all is the principle which, when properly understood, will enable man to live well. Thus man himself becomes and is an alchemist, really whether he knows it or not. But the bringing through of this knowledge into his awareness in a way that he can control it, so that by art he can perfect nature, enables him to perform the great work. So Mrs. Atwood tells us, obviously, that the great work is a simple fact, and that this great work is the perfection of the consciousness of man, by means of which this consciousness ultimately regains its universal completeness and is reunited with its divine source. Great work is the production of the heavenly man, the production of the universal true principle, which is the elixir of eternal life, because it bestows immortality. It is the transmuter of all base metals, because it provides the means by which every material element of man's compound nature is transformed into its spiritual equivalent. And it is also the symbol of the removing of the flaws from precious stones and the manufacturing of artificial gems. The precious stones and the artificial gems relate particularly to man's psychic field, where these stones, like the pearl of great price and the rose diamond of the rosy cross, all represent the sole attributes of man, the shining adornments which exist within his own nature. Just as surely also as the Sangreal, or the Holy Grail, the cup of the blood of the King, is the human heart, containing as it does the blood of the King, or the blood of life. So this Holy Grail is likewise the ancient symbol of the alchemical vessel in which the transmutation takes place. Therefore this transmutation is also a Holy Eucharist. It is the mysterious transformation of the blood and wine into the life and body of Christ. All the legends and fables bearing upon these things have arisen in the consciousness of man, who is dimly aware of a mystery which he has consciously forgotten. But locked within himself, man is aware, as Omar so well says, that from his base metals must be filed the key that shall unlock the door they howl without. That actually in man himself is the whole of the Hermetic mystery. That all these books are therefore veiled accounts attempting to preserve, down through the corruptions of world conditions, the same esoteric doctrine that was taught in the sanctuaries of Greece, Egypt, and India. Yet a new language has been developed and devised. And now Miss Atwood points out one of the interesting and important parallels, namely that this new language that was developed by the alchemists and was gradually taken over by the chemists is the language of a scientific salvation. That in these formulas and rituals, it is no longer simple piety that accomplishes the works. That man is actually capable of a voluntary cooperation with nature in the advancement of all of the works of light. She then hazards something that may seem a little difficult for us to comprehend, but I believe that basically she is right. Namely, that the works of light possible to man include not only the improvement of his own nature, but ultimately the regeneration of his world. That actually these works of man represent the power to use light, not only to cleanse the body, the soul, and the spirit, but to cleanse all of nature, to cleanse the air, the earth, the fire. That it is perfectly possible for man to charge the very energy fields of his planet, just as he is charged himself by these fields. And that man, by the development and perfection of his own life, makes all things new again in the world around him, and in this way fulfills the promise that from his own righteousness there shall come a new heaven and a new earth. That the alchemical mystery, therefore, is a kind of chain reaction, and we are beginning to appreciate that such a thing might be conceivable when we begin to think in terms of nuclear physics. We are now in a position where we realize the tremendous energy forces can be loosed, which have an incredible and unknown effect upon not only living things, but upon the very fountains of life, the sources of the energies and the powers with which we are concerned. And perhaps Mrs. Atwood would have been very much impressed had she been able to live to realize that in the fission of the atom, we have a proof of the release of infinite light power from one tiny, almost incredibly small source. We also know that the fission that we have now achieved is only a very partial fission, and that in all probability there is enough energy in each atom to perfect or destroy an entire solar system, all depending upon use. And use is moral alchemy. Use is the power which arises in man, by means of which he becomes a gardener in the garden of the metals, by which he becomes the faithful guardian of the tree of life, upon which grow the stars of all the metals in the Museum Hermeticum. Also, Mrs. Atwood has come to the conclusion that this process must be a completely orderly and exact one. That somewhere along the line in the destruction and decline of the mysteries, those aspects of alchemy which were truly scientific were relatively lost. One of the German princes finally imprisoned an alchemist and set him to work to find the secret of the transmutation of metals. This alchemist never succeeded, but among the experiments which did succeed was the discovery of the formula for Dresden china, and as a result this particular king became a very rich and powerful man without the transmutation of metals. And the whole history of alchemy and chemistry has been a history of byproducts. The search for the elixir of life has enriched our pharmacopoeia, has given us numerous devices and inventions, has led to such discoveries as illuminating gas and things of this kind. They were things found along the way by men searching for something else. But it is interesting that in their search along the way they found practical, valuable, and useful things, that they discovered the operations of law, and therefore that it might not be entirely fair to say that chemistry is the same son of alchemy, a mad mother. Actually, all of these alchemical experiments were based upon certain convictions. But as Mrs. Atwood points out, somewhere along the line, the direct course was lost. Somewhere in the course of man's existence, he began to look around him for means of applying knowledge. And in this, Mrs. Atwood quotes from the Instauratio Magna of Lord Bacon, in which his lordship points out that man, in the course of time, has learned to apply wisdom to almost everything except himself. He has taken skill and turned it to breeding better cattle or raising more grain to the acre. But he has forgotten in the course of this to turn his skill within himself to the improvement of his own being. This was the difference between alchemy and chemistry, essentially. Chemistry, as we know it today, is devoted to experimenting with the elements of nature. Alchemy with the elements of nature in man. Always man has had a tendency to look out from himself toward other things, and to take the energies which he possesses and direct them to the victory over other things. However, the very laws by which man hopes ultimately to conquer the world are the same laws by which man must finally learn to conquer himself. And alchemy points out that if man first achieves the kingdom of heaven, or the transmutation within himself, then all other things will be added to him. For it is said of the powder of the red lion, which is the great powder of the projection of metals, that it will transform into perfect gold 100,000 times its own weight. This undoubtedly refers to something. We can say that insight turned upon the unknown will transform 100,000 times its own mass of ignorance into truth. That virtue will transform many, many times its own mass into common good. In any event, however, the problem was to apply a knowledge of exactitudes toward the great problem, and that is man. Why is this so essentially necessary? Why cannot we ultimately win by simply putting the world in order around man and then permitting man to enjoy this fruit of his own labor? The answer is pretty obvious, that all the changes that occur in the world must first arise within man. Therefore, man cannot perfect the experiment in nature until he has perfected it in himself. He can continue his undisciplined struggle with nature. He can continue this effort to overwhelm nature by skill alone. But without directive, without insight, without consciousness concerning ways, means, and ends, without vision, the people perish. And without having within his own nature the achievement of the magnum opus, or the great work, it is impossible for man to direct nature, to control it, or to turn it to the fulfillments of its own purpose. Until man knows the end, he cannot lead nature to that end. Thus, in some mysterious way, the great experiment must first be performed in man and then in the world. These are the two great laboratories, the laboratory of the human soul and the laboratory of the cosmos. Whenever the rule is found actually and absolutely in one, it will be applicable to the other. For as Hermes Trismegistus has written, that which is above is the same as that which is below. That which is the lesser is the same as that which is the greater. For all things are bound together by the law of analogy. In this pattern, then, the search for the inward transmutation must be a search after a science of the handling, the directing, the multiplying, the expanding, the extending, and the transforming of light. This light must come into man, for this light must make reason possible to man. For reason is mind plus light. Love is heart plus light. Strength, even of body, is physical resource plus light. The mystical experience is dedication and devotion plus light. Light must always be the agent of all these things. And if this light be lifted up, it will draw all things to it. And this light is the light which cometh into the world, and lighteth every man who cometh into the world. So the problem, again, is the magnificent chemistry of light. Now, it is obvious that the Atwoods were moving very closely toward the Indian concept of yoga, that they were sensing the same light principle that is also to be found in Mahayana Buddhism. The world of the radiance of truth, the world of the eternal light in which all things live and move and have their being. Now, how is this light to be made available? The alchemist said that it had to be extracted from darkness. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. So the base substances seen in the alchemical retort have to do with light hidden in darkness. Just as gold is hidden in the base metals of the earth, just as the life which the small plant takes from the ground comes from the dark mother in which its roots are placed, so everywhere in the darkness of earth there is life, and this life makes things grow. And the vitality and life in nature must in some way be discovered and separated from darkness. It must be as in the opening chapters of Genesis, which according to Mrs. Atwood absolutely recapitulate the entire alchemical process, and that any chemist thoroughly understanding the first chapter of Genesis can actually transform base metals into gold, physically as well as spiritually. Because in this section is contained the summary of creation. And this summary of creation is the key to the continuance of creation. For in the world of the metals, creation is forever. In the world of God, creation is continuous. Creation is not something that started and then suddenly ceased and only the products went on. The very processes of Genesis are being repeated every instant and will be to the end of existence. For constantly creation is unfolding itself. Constantly light is descending into darkness, and darkness in its fullness of term is releasing light again by the mystery of the second birth. So each person is searching for light. And how is he going to find it? How is he going to make this exploration into the dark mystery of base matter in order to extract light? In addition to light itself, what is the most common base matter of our existences? Not now in terms of physical materials, but in terms of that which we all have in common. One answer is that we all have the base material of living. Living is something that happens to everything that is alive. Everything that has life right in it lives. Therefore, living is in some way an unfolding of the life-light principle. So each person lives every day. He lives according to his knowledge, according to his insight or the lack thereof. He lives well or badly, according to his own instincts, his selfishness, his nature, and according to the mysterious impulses which plague his psychic integration. But there is this common matter of life or living, and we may call it experience. For experience is really nothing more than the gathering up of the treasures of the light. And these are the treasures which thieves cannot break in and steal, nor rust destroy. So each day, whether we are aware of it or not, we are experiencing something. And every experience is an experiment in light. Everything that happens to us has a light meaning, but this does not always mean that we know what that meaning is. But into our own reservoirs, our capacities, are stored away these works of the light. And Bacon refers to these also by the same general theme, the works of light. Now, the works of light in nature result in growth and purification. The works of light in the experience of man result in a form of knowledge, a form of self-education continuously going on in nature. Everything that man does teaches him something. Only unfortunately man does not always know what he is taught. Therefore he goes on experiencing much and learning comparatively little. But nature preserves in the subconscious nature of man that which he has learned. And this becomes, so to say, a supply of crude ore. This is the supply of impregnated material. For in experience, the gold of value is hidden within the darkness of ignorance. And in the alchemical tradition, a dragon was fashioned to symbolize this. And in the Greek legend, this dragon wound itself around the tree of life, on which hung the mysterious golden fleece. And it was to discover this golden fleece that Jason and the Argonauts made their great journey. And this was part of a ritual of initiation into the mysteries. So man's evolution, his process of existence down through time, has resulted in the gradual accumulation of a properly impregnated material. This material is in his memory. It is in his subjective thinking. It is in the background of everything that he is. This impregnated material is the basis of his career, his home, his business. It is the reason why he can pass an examination in school. It is the reason why he can fill out an application form when he wants a job. All of this building continuously of light in darkness leads us to the alchemical certainty that there is a continuous process going on in man in which the works of light are achieving victory over the works of darkness. And yet the light and the darkness are together, and they are not clearly divisible, as Bellamy points out. Somewhere the dawn or the break of the auroral light must come. And Mrs. Atwood looks to the Hermetic mystery to try to understand these wonderful occurrences. Taking the alchemical thinking again, you come to such problems, naturally, as faith, understanding, dedication, discipline. You find that in the Hermetic mystery there has to be some mysterious agent, the active agent of the stone. Now, the active agent of the stone is a kind of mordant. It is a catalyzing agent of some nature. And In alchemy, faith plays very much this part, because something has to stir this compound which lies in obscurity. Somewhere the Jason has to go forth and search for the golden fleece. Somewhere in man's nature there must gradually arise the conviction that there is a mystery, and that this mystery can be solved. In ancient times, education included the clear statement of this simple fact, but modern education no longer does include any intimation that there is a mystery, or that it can be solved, or that there is a road or a way that leads to the accomplishment of the universal medicine. So in the alchemical tradition, actually, strange names are given to familiar things. Yet these familiar things are not in themselves simple. They are not in themselves commonplace. We can say that it sounds much of a come-down that some elaborate alchemical material should turn out to be faith. But actually, we have no way of knowing the full dimension of faith. It is probably stronger and greater and more mysterious than any physical, chemical, or element we have ever explored. It is because certain words have lost their meaning, have lost their profundity, that we do not recognize the value of valuable words. And one of the most valuable of these words is in itself faith. Faith has some kind of a transmuting power in life. Faith releases light into the soul, even as doubt obscures light. Now in alchemy also, there is always the ancient master. Alchemy constantly refers to some strange, wandering adept, some deeply versed and secret one who possesses the knowledge. In the Paracelsian corpus, this is called Elias Artista, or Elias the artist, a kind of mysterious, immortal, wandering alchemist who never dies, who possesses the elixir of life, who has made the great transmutation and goes around the world forever, selecting dedicated and faithful disciples, visiting them in their laboratories and revealing to them the secrets of the arts when their own merits deserve such revelation. Who is the mysterious Elias Artista? The one master alchemist who never dies, who goes on and on, revealing to those who are ready the secret of the stone. One way of looking upon him is quite a simple way, and he is the alchemical tradition itself. He is the one who cannot die because he is a great conviction. He is a great mystery locked in human consciousness. But he appears only to those who are worthy. He makes himself known to the alchemist only when this alchemist has prayerfully dedicated his labors to truth and to light. Then he appears and gives the key to the mystery and then vanishes again and is seen no more. This represents, Mrs. Atwood's thinking, what we would almost term today the archetypal psychological teacher, locked within our own consciousness and locked also within the consciousness of universals. In the root of every integration or organization that exists in nature is the mysterious fact of the immutable mathematical formula upon which that organization is based. Everything in the root of itself is instinctively a work of light. Everything has within its own nature the strange seal of its own identity. Elias the artist is perhaps partly tradition, partly the great story that has come down to us. Partly it is also the subconscious teacher in ourselves, the old one, the folk consciousness that we have. Perhaps it is descended to us in our blood, in our heredity, Perhaps it is the symbol of the infinite sequence of previous embodiments by which we have come to our present state. But it is the old one and the true one locked in us, locked in our conscious experience, and available only to us when we have ourselves performed the works of light. So the struggle or the labor always concerns with this. And now Mrs. Atwood goes into considerable detail in relation to Neoplatonism, quoting from Plotinus, Proclus, and many of the other mystics of North Africa and Athens, relating to the works of light in terms of the motion of consciousness itself from ignorance to illumination. Illumination being, of course, the final absorption into light. And man's growth as an hermetic experience deals with the 7 steps of the ladder of alchemy. And this ladder, the Escalade de la Sage, is in actuality the same as the 7 steps of Bacon's mysterious ladder of the arts, or ladder of wisdom. In this, consciousness ascends through 7 steps, represented by the orbits of the planets, which are in turn the alchemical symbols of the elements. Therefore, as the metals and the elements are arranged upon a ladder, or to form the links of the golden chain of Homer, which bound earth to the pinnacle of Olympus, so this ladder of the wise represents the 7 ascending levels of human consciousness, by means of which man rises from ignorance to universal insight. All this, of course, is theoretically quite understandable, but the question always remains, how is it done? How is it physically, psychologically, or spiritually possible to perform this work? This becomes, of course, the difference between theoretical alchemy and practical alchemy. And it is the method of how this can be done, and not the fact that it can be done, which constitutes the esoteric doctrine in the Hermetic sciences. Mrs. Atwood senses this and realizes it, and tries, in the light of the study of many of these deep works, to put together a formula, a pattern, not now to be used chemically, although she believes, and most alchemists have taught, that the formula for the regeneration of man will also regenerate the metals. But to discover this mystical insight by means of which the human being can achieve the transmutation of his own consciousness from darkness into light, or to free the souls of the metals from their bodies in order that they may unite to form the universal medicine. Now, all the alchemists have agreed upon one thing, namely that you cannot combine the souls of metals while these metals are in various conditions of their own development. You cannot take the outward bodies of elements and force these bodies together. You cannot take common lead and mingle it with iron and produce anything more than a kind of alloy of lead and iron. These two will not accept each other. They will not become actual souls united. They will only be bodies united and souls in stress. Alchemy creates another symbol, the Hermetic Mercury, the mysterious symbol of the universal solvent. Mercury is said to be the one element that will accept other elements into its own soul. Therefore, Mercury becomes, in a mysterious way, in the alchemical tradition, the symbol of Christ, because also it is the child of the sun and moon, or the offspring of heaven and earth. But even in the case of these elements, the alchemists tell us definitely that crude iron and crude silver cannot be united to produce the mystery. That before these elements can be combined, they must die. For unless the seed die, says St. Paul, it shall not live again. Therefore, the mystery, like the mystery of the early Christian convert, is the mystery of the firstborn of them that sleep in death. The whole story has to be a story of resurrection. It has to be a story of the rolling away of the stone and of the empty sepulchre. It is the story of that which has risen from its own mortality to become the eternal proof and hope of immortality for all creatures. For in the resurrection of Christ, said the old apostles, is the proof of the resurrection of all that lives. This in turn, relating to the metals in the alchemical mystery, is that the metals must die. They must be crucified. They must descend into darkness. They must pass into limbo, which is the retort, or the alchemical vessel. And here they must be caused to suffer, as in a purgatorial, which is a purging or cleansing. And here, in the due course of time, they will ultimately be forgiven or restored by the descent of Christ into limbo for the salvation of souls. So now our alchemists tell us that these elements must die. And the question is, what are meant by these elements? I think that the Buddhist would answer that very simply, that these elements are the sensory perceptions and the mental focus. They are the elements that form the mysterious six-pointed star with the sun or self or sattva in the center, the mysterious shield of David of the Jewish Kabbalah. These representing then the psychic integration centers of man, representing the powers of the sensory perceptions. These must die in order that their own secret energy may be released again, so that only by man's victory over the senses is the message or the power or the true reality that is locked in these senses, as in the basic matter of experience. Only in this way can it be released. So we come to meditation, to Zen, to practically any of the disciplines of Neoplatonism or the ancient Greeks. For the death of the sensory perceptions is simply quietude, meditation, the absolute relief of man from the pressure of the objective functions of his own composite nature. The man becoming still causes confusion to die in him. And it is the death of confusion that results in the rise of value. For when the confusion of the testimony of the senses has been stilled, then the wisdom that is locked in these senses becomes compatible and can mingle. Thus, when the senses and their functions are suspended, the principle of consciousness upon which they all depend is realized in its unity. In other words, the elements, the principles, the energies of the senses perceptions can be alchemically united as long as the senses themselves do not function. So by a complete suspension of the personal, the universal elements within us can come together. But while we continually disturb these elements by our own objective awareness, they cannot come together. Mrs. Atwood feels that this is the burden of part of the Eleusinian mystery ritual, and certainly of Neoplatonism, which is based thereon, and the Orphic Rhapsodies. That these tell the story of a mystical suspension of error and illusion, by means of which reality can reaffirm itself, by which the individual will find in principles these things which he cannot discover while he is addicted to the shadows or appearances of things. Let us take a simple example of the point involved, namely take religion. we will imagine that an individual is torn between religion and science. While religion is in its crystallized integration within himself, while religion in him is a series of specific beliefs, while religion has to do with the consubstantiation of the host, while religion has to do with the assumption of the Virgin, while religion has to do with the co-eternity of the three persons of the Trinity, while these factors are in consciousness, religion is working in its own way, but it is not assimilable with anything else. We go then over to science, and we say that while this man is dedicated to biology, so that his universe moves around the central axis of biological situation, or he is a physicist, or he is an astronomer, or he is dedicated to any of the works of the light of science, he is then not only involved, but by his own limitations imposed upon his own areas, he cannot even circumscribe the whole boundary of science. He is only working with a little area. A scientist thus engaged and preoccupied, and a religionist thus engaged and preoccupied, cannot meet. They can have certain superficial, friendly relationships, perhaps, but they have no identity, no conscious realization of each other. Yet if either of these was able to completely disassociate his consciousness from any aspect of his labor or reactive work and go to the substance of it, if the religionist could separate religion from theology, if the scientist could separate science from the sciences, in other words, perform this alchemical reduction to source, then science would realize that the substance upon which it is built is inevitable, immutable, universal law. And the religionist would discover that the substance upon which faith is built is inevitable and immutable, universal law. In their principles, therefore, these two can unite. But once they have become structures, they cannot unite. This is why alchemy says that you have to destroy the outward forms of things. You have to calcinate them. You have to burn them or corrupt them or destroy them until nothing of the body remains but ashes. Then the living spirit within these things can unite. For in all life there is an identity of truth light. And this identity of truth light is the secret of compatibility. And compatibility, or the union or mingling and identification of these elements, finally represents the amalgam from which the great stone of the wise is projected by alchemy. So first, by the reduction of all things to their essences, they become susceptible of union. And out of the union of these divided elements comes the sudden re-experience of the unity of the archetype of life from which they descended. The continual discovery of increasing unities. The ascent from particulars to generals. The gradual disintegration of the external natures of things and the re-establishment of their internals. In this way, the great alchemical transmutation takes place. This can be put in terms of chemistry and will probably operate chemically. It can be put in terms of religion and will operate religiously, or in terms of philosophy. But in man, the peculiar term of it is in the term of yogic consciousness searching. For the whole redemption of man lies in the reduction of the confusion or complexity of man to the absolute stillness, which is the death of the divided parts, And from the death of these divided parts, a spirit rises. The spirit released from confusion, released from difference, from discord, and from the various vibratory patterns of elements, suddenly is restored to its own light nature. So in the alchemical tradition, again, the purpose is forever to reduce the bodily interference of things with the unfoldment of the life within body. The grand experiment is therefore to be attained in universal conscious re-identification with the infinite. This means the final elimination of the dross in all things, the transmutation of every base metal into principle, the final falling away of all bodies, illusions, beliefs, creeds, sects, divisions, which exist primarily in the mental nature of man. When these fall away, when these are overcome, when these are relaxed and released so that they no longer interfere, then man gradually brings together the essences of all things. And in the reunion of essences within the living alchemical retort of his own soul, man achieves the great transmutation. He becomes the adept, he becomes the yoga, he attains the samadhi, he becomes the embodiment of the entire discipline of antiquity, which had for its essential purpose the production of the man of light, the production of the luminous androgyne, the great complete composite being, which is hidden from us by the confusion and complexity of our own mortal existence. So alchemy approached in this way is the burden of Mrs. Atwood's study. And I think as we proceed with it, we realize, and we will realize more if we read her work, the tremendous amount of thought and the tremendous amount of insight that went into it. We wonder at the strange story of how it was done. We know the universe works mysteriously. Perhaps in her we had some strange alchemical transmutation by which, in the early years of the 19th century, she was able to produce this work. In any event, it is a dignified and important volume, and certainly one of the worthiest to appear in the interpretation of the Hermetic arts. Well, I think we'd better let you get your bus and go home now.